Hello, friends. It's my pleasure to welcome you into The Light from Ocean Reef, a podcast aimed at bringing you the light of hope and wisdom wherever you are. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm a graduate of Yale and Princeton, a former television and radio host, a pastor, and most importantly, a longtime follower of Jesus, a husband, a dad, and a friend. I currently serve as chaplain in residence at the beautiful Ocean Reef community in Key Largo, Florida, surrounded by some of the most inventive people on our planet. In this podcast, I share teachings from the Bible, conversations with some fascinating friends, and personal observations about the times in which we're living. I hope that some of this can be helpful to you. Today, we're presenting a Bible study on the book of Nehemiah that I've called Builders of Eternity. I hope you'll get a lot from this session that will help you to live and lead more thoughtfully in the various spheres of your life. Let's join the program right now. We are picking up the story today in the second chapter of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 2, 11 through 20.
I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding upon. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Wall and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or when and what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Honorite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Gesem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it."
Thank you. The word of the Lord.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you so much, Frank. Yeah. So if you are a newcomer in a circle today, you may not know that Nehemiah had been, up to this point, the cupbearer to the king of Persia, a man by the name of Artaxerxes. It was the leading power of that age. And the cupbearer role that Nehemiah occupied was not simply somebody that tasted the cup for poison. It was a chief of staff role for the entire empire. It was an extraordinarily high position of responsibility. And as we saw over the last week or two, having heard about the plight of conditions in Jerusalem, all that had gone wrong in the hope of the rebuilding of the life of Israel, Nehemiah had been deeply moved, driven to his knees in prayer and in grief. He had carefully sought the Lord. He had prepared his heart. He had developed a plan for presenting the need to his boss. He had gone and gotten permission from his boss to make the arduous journey and to take a leave of absence. That was a major risk that he took when he asked for this permission, because in ancient times the kings were not particularly kind towards those who did not put the king and the king's priorities number one. And nonetheless, by God's grace, the favor of Artaxerxes fell upon Nehemiah, God's favor through that king, and he was given not only permission to go, but a military escort, all the materials necessary for the building project, and he sets out on the journey. So we pick up the story in verse 11, when Nehemiah just simply says, "I went to Jerusalem." And I was just amused by even that brief little phrase, because he says it like he has just gone to the corner store. It's like, I went from Ocean Reef to Homestead, is what it sounds like. But in reality, he just made a trip that is equivalent to riding halfway across the United States on horseback. It's a 1,500-mile journey. In the days before high-speed rail. It is a really significant journey. I know if you have read the accounts of St. Paul in the book of Acts or in any of his epistles, you're struck by a similar sense of almost cavalier mention of, "I went here and I went there." And some years ago, I really took a close look at the distance that Paul traveled on foot, on horseback, sometimes by ship. And he just simply has to be the greatest traveler that human beings have ever known in terms of his willingness to go amazing journeys over numbingly difficult, rugged terrain. I know that when I followed the journeys of Paul, and some of you have made a trip like that. I took one of these with my former church some years ago, and we went by air-conditioned bus and airplane and were exhausted. And yet he went all of this way and then just describes his travels as if he's made a trip down to Publix. So this is a characteristic, by the way, of some of God's most faithful servants. And you've probably met people like this who describe great endeavors as if they were nothing. And the reason is that they're so preoccupied by a sense of the worthiness of the task that they're not going to be all that preoccupied on all it costs them to undertake it. And that's a leadership lesson I've marked out for us in our outline today, that leaders are often willing to go to great lengths to pursue the purposes of God. And the miles that they travel in pursuing those purposes always pale in their minds next to the mandate and the meaning that comes from pursuing the call of God. And you can probably think of that. I've heard women say, so what have you done over the years? Oh, I raised 6 kids, and then they move on. You raised 6 humanoids. And we know all that went into that, right? But their sense of the meaning and the mandate they had is much, much larger than the sense of the cost of it for that. So I hope that that's a mindset that defines us too. I hope that we're those kinds of people who don't bitterly count every mile that we have to walk in order to get to our goals. I know we've met people like that, right? They're mainly talking about all of their problems, their difficulties, all that they've spent trying to do something. I hope that we are one of those people so focused on the goal and on the great God that calls us to do whatever we're called to do that we don't complain much about the natural challenges of getting there. It's okay now and then to do that. This was hard. I'm tired today. Could you pray for me? All good. But at the end of the day, I think most of us want to be the kind of people that are preoccupied with the privilege that it is to be agents of the purposes of God in our families, in our church life, in our other endeavors. The story goes on, and Nehemiah says, and after staying there, meaning in Jerusalem, 3 days, and I want to just observe here, it's significant that Nehemiah gives us this detail, right? Why did he tell us that I stayed there for 3 days? Well, we know that Nehemiah is a goal-oriented person. He's not afraid of working hard, of risking a lot, traveling far to achieve his purposes. But this little detail also shows us, I think, I hope I'm not reading too much into this, that he's not some automaton. He's not some workaholic, hyper-compulsive type A who cannot bear to ever lay down the plow. Having worked very hard to get to Jerusalem, Nehemiah apparently takes a 3-day break. He gives himself some recovery time in order to prepare for the next stage. I remember a story I heard many years ago of a group of missionaries who were traveling through Africa, and they hired a group of indigenous folks to travel with them because they knew the terrain very well, and they were also the porters or the bearers of the physical weight of the journey as they were carrying the luggage and all the other possessions of the missionaries. And at one point, as they're going along, just right in the middle of the day, the porters stop. And they put down all that they've been carrying, and they sit down. And the missionaries are going, what's this? And the head of the porter group says, well, we have to stop here. And the head missionary says, well, why do we have to stop here? He said, we're waiting for our souls to catch up. And there was just sort of a beauty to that, I thought, this notion that our spirits probably can't run as fast, as hard, be worked as continuously as sometimes we allow our bodies to be. And my wife is sitting in the pew going, boy, you should take your advice, Dan. You should pay attention to that. But that's why I say it out loud, because I do need to, and I think many of us who are super type A types need to be able to pace ourselves and be thoughtful. As destructive as it is to be one of those people who sigh and complain over every mile traveled in life, it's equally dangerous to be one of those people who don't consider the toll of the traveling. And so, which of those excesses do you think you're most prone to? Are you one of those mile counters, or are you one of those maniacs that just keeps going? And how do you find more balance? Jesus himself was a model, I think, in this regard. He worked a full day. He really traveled a lot of distance on foot, had incredible impact. But he also had this rhythm to his life of rest. He would often call his disciples to stop and to rest with him as he prepared for the next stage, whatever it was. And I think it's interesting to note that even in his death and resurrection, he patterns this for us. After the work of the cross, how long did Jesus take to rise from the dead? Yeah. There's just kind of this poetry to the scriptures and the way they tell this, that God also rested. So the leadership lesson here for us is that leaders actually regard rest as an essential part of their overall work. Any of you Jason Bourne fans, Robert Ludlum? Do you remember the line in which Bourne says, as he finally giving himself a break, rest is a weapon, sleep is a weapon. He said, it's a weapon. It's going to prepare me to be more effective now once I rest and get up from my sleep. So there's so many wonderful books about the value of this. One of my very favorites is a recent book is called The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan. And it's a double entendre. If you want to get the rest of God in your life, you want to know the rest of him, take some rest is what he says in this. But he also does a deep dive on what Sabbath means. And Buchanan's an absolutely delightful writer. And one of the other books I can recommend, and I don't get any kickbacks for this promotion, that he wrote a book recently called The God Walk. And it's a meditation, a Christian meditation on walking, on the human act of walking, which he contends is the Christian physical spiritual discipline. The Hindus have yoga, right? The Muslims have the pilgrimage. For Christians, it's walking. And he makes a very powerful and vivid and delightful case for it. And the thing to do is to buy the audio version of this and just listen to a chapter a day as you go walking. And you're just going to really enjoy that one. A few others that I've enjoyed over the years about rest, and Ordering Your Private World by Gordon MacDonald. Have you ever had Gordon MacDonald speak here? Do you know who he is? Gordon MacDonald was the head of the largest Protestant non-denominational church in New England. He was the president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. He went through a profound moral and marital crisis from which both his wife and he recovered. And he went on to amazing leadership after that. His book, Restoring Your Spiritual Passion, was a narrative about that. But his book on Ordering Your Private World, finding the balance between work and rest, is a beautiful piece of reflection. In any event, Nehemiah, having rested, is now ready to move forward again. And in verse 12 we read, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. I guess he had told, maybe he had told his boss. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. Now, to appreciate what's being said here, you have to remember that Nehemiah has got this painful burden on his heart, and he's got a tremendous vision in his head. And we know that he's, from what we studied before, that he's practically bleeding with grief and frustration over all that is the devastation that's gone on in Jerusalem. And God's given him this magnificent vision for the complete restoration of the strength and the glory that Jerusalem had before its destruction by the Babylonians in 586. And I think that there are times in our lives, too, when we get filled with a passion over the needs and the necessities of our lives. And there are times when we're so frustrated by what's not being done, we want to blurt out those frustrations to anybody who will listen. And there are times when we do. Things are just, this is so wrong. This so needs addressing. And we blurt that out. And there are occasions when we just kind of want to grab other people by the lapels and shake them into seeing what we see and feeling what we see and working with us to change the way things are going. That could happen in our families. It can happen in our workplaces, our church, or even in our wider society. We meet many people who feel that way. And so I think this is what is interesting about what Nehemiah does here. This is what is striking to me. In spite of all of his passion, he doesn't try to enlist a whole army of people at the start. He instead picks a very small handful of people to start to bring them on board with what he is sensing. He doesn't spew out the entirety of everything that's on his mind. Here's what we're going to do, and all the plans and all the rest of that. But he keeps his big picture vision largely to himself at the beginning. He doesn't raise a big ruckus, because you can imagine that this guy who's arrived with this big military ensemble with him, entourage with him, would draw a lot of attention. He doesn't take any chances of sort of drawing a crowd, but he goes out quietly in the night, and we're told specifically, he's the only one in the scouting party even on horseback. Now, he could have laid out his whole plan. He could have appointed officers and assigned duties from the start. But he doesn't do that because his goal here is really simple and very specific. He wants to develop a small cadre of people who will catch for themselves a passion for the needs and a vision for the possibilities that are ahead. And I think there's a leadership lesson in this too, that the very best leaders are willing to allow vision to grow from the bottom up rather than from the top down. This is something I've tried to practice in my own life. Instead of trying to always describe all that we recently completed a major renovation project in the church up in Chicago that I used to serve in, and I was very tempted to paint, do all the PowerPoints that showed people all what we could do. And instead, I took a small handful of people down to the youth center and showed them where the carpet was stained and how the place smelled mildewy and hadn't been taken care of. And they just got it. They just got it. And suddenly now I had a group of people who said, yeah, we need to do something about renovating our capacity to connect with kids and to develop them as disciples. So I think you probably have done this in various ways in your life. You favor nurturing an organism from the bottom up rather than creating an organization from the top down. I think leaders are often more like gardeners than they are like generals, or at least they're doing both of those things at times. They want to convert hearts before they try to control behaviors, and they think that personal discovery is going to inspire greater effort and life change than impersonal discipline ever could. Does that make sense? Do you believe that, by the way? Yeah, it's just, it helps when it comes from the heart. So I think that if we want to start a revolution of any kind, we have to help people catch a vision for themselves. And instead of just talking about the needs, bring them face to face with the specific needs. Don't lay out the whole picture, but share principles and invite them to help develop the plan for addressing things. I once read about a leader who was repeatedly encouraged by the people around him to seize complete control of the troubled situation because he had the capacity to do that, and who actually saw all of the problems himself and had the very best of plans in his own mind, who could have commanded complete obedience to his ideas and compelled groveling response from every human being. But instead, he picked 12 people and started to journey with them and to love them and to listen to them and to help them gain a progressively larger vision of human need and of the nature of the Heavenly Father. And he told them stories and he asked questions, provocative questions, instead of giving lectures and barking orders. And he trusted that this approach would have more far-reaching consequences than mounting a little military campaign to wrest control of Israel from the Romans. You know who I'm talking about? Okay. And he started this revolution that spanned the world. He started this movement that changed history, that created wonderful new rhythms and institutions. It's not done fixing all that's wrong with human beings, and in its process of growing certainly made lots of mistakes. But this is how the best leadership works. And I think it's why Nehemiah approached the rebuilding of Jerusalem the way he did. Verse 13, by night I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate. Why do you think they called it the Jackal Well? Probably because there was a jackal that hung out there. There's certain places where the stray cat shows up again around here regularly. And the Dung Gate, draw your own conclusions. But I went out there examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Nehemiah's party begins by making a survey of the walls and the gates of the southernmost part of the city. They leave by the Valley Gate, which is at the southwestern corner of Jerusalem, and they head east across the southern face of the wall, or the broken down wall, toward the Dung Gate, which is at the southeastern corner. And what's significant about this expedition is that it is concerned with the last part of the city with which I think most people would have started. He starts surveying the least likely part of the city from one point of view. I know that when I am trying to problem solve, my tendency is to almost always focus my attention where things seem to be to me or likely are the worst. That's where I go first, very often. And if I'd been in charge of this whole little expedition, I'd have said, hey, let's go to the northern part of the city first, because it's almost always from the higher ground to the north of the city that Jerusalem's enemies in the past had attacked. And it was likely that the northernmost fortifications had been the worst damaged over the years by all of those attacks. But Nehemiah takes his party to look first at the portion of the walls that once rose above the very steep valley of Hinnom, Hinnom, to the south of Jerusalem, which, by the way, is where we get the word Gehenna, which means Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna in the Aramaic, which is the word for hell. It's because it was over those walls and down in the valley beneath them that all the trash was thrown, and fires were lit down there to burn up the trash, and associations with the vision of a burning place grew up in association with the Valley of Hinnom. But he takes them to the place where the fortifications are likely in the best condition. Why? The idea is maybe he wants to discourage them that. He wants to kind of build people up. He's building a team, so he takes them to a place that, this isn't going to be that hard. He's building morale, possibly. I think another possibility, and I've noted this in your outline, is that leaders have a tendency to look for strengths and then weaknesses. They have a desire to build on strengths where possible, rather than call out weaknesses. Have you ever had a person in your life who, even when they were concerned with trying to help you with your weaknesses, began with your strengths? Who is that? And tell us how that happened. Can you think of anybody in your life you'd be willing to describe?
A few years ago, I started painting for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And the art teacher that I had a remarkable skill for looking at everyone's painting and first identifying what she thought was best in the picture, what you had done well, be it one section, one part of the drawing, the sky that turned out well, and totally disregarded how awful the rest of it was. And then she'd proceed to make one or two comments about how to improve the rest of it.
Yeah.
But you felt so good from the positive things she said, the other was easy to swallow.
I love it. What a great story. Yeah. For years, my personnel review, annual review, was done by the chairman of the personnel committee and the vice chair of the board of trustees at Christ Church of Oak Brook, a man by the name of Carl Dill. Carl was the chief information officer of McDonald's Corporation and then the chief information officer of Time Warner. And he is, to this day, a phenomenal leadership and executive coach, leadership development and executive coach. And he would, very much like Eleanor described, he would do my review, and he had a column A and a column B. And column A was like 15 or 20 things he admired about what I did. And by the time he walked through that, he had caught everything. He caught me in the act of doing some things right. And he was able to parse and describe it. By the end of column A, I'm thinking to myself, this guy gets me, what motivates me, what I'm reaching for, what I'm trying to contribute, better than anybody on the planet. He is amazing. And then he would have maybe 2, maybe 3 things in column B, and they would be ruthlessly tough. You need to change this. You need to move from this behavior to this behavior. I see this pattern. Last year we talked about this. You're still not moving on this. I mean, but just like Eleanor said, I knew how much he loved me. And I felt so built up by all the things that were still going right. They didn't overwhelm me. And I was able to move forward. There's a huge amount of research on leadership by the Gallup organization, which I know we associate with the Gallup poll, but is actually one of the leading leadership development consultancies in the world. And they work with major governments. They've worked extensively with the Pentagon. And what they've discovered is that if you start with strengths and you get people to really work with their strengths, they're much more willing to focus to address weaknesses. And they will come to pull alongside of them people that bring strengths in their areas of weakness. So it's a proven, well-documented approach for leadership development. It's hard for us to do that in our daily lives, I think. It's hard to do that with people. I think sometimes with our family members, it's very, very difficult to do that. We want them so badly to grow in these areas that we harp on the weaknesses. I was listening, driving somewhere one day, and I listened to this television or this radio interview in which parents were invited to call in and share problems that they were having raising their kids. And there was this one woman who shared her exasperation with her daughter, who doesn't do anything, is what she kept saying. She doesn't do anything. She prefers hanging out with her friends to studying, prefers doing this other stuff to helping around the house. And the counselor asked a very perceptive question. The counselor said, what does she do when she's doing nothing? What is she doing when she isn't doing what you want her to do? And then she goes on and says, is she organizing their activities? Maybe she's got a gift for planning and leadership. She's the party organizer for the group. Is she counseling them? Maybe she has a gift for listening and care. Is she driving them around or assisting them with the tasks of their lives? Maybe she has a gift for practical helps or for teaching. And the mom was understandably dumbfounded, and then she started thinking, well, I guess she does do this, and I guess she does do that, and come to think of it, she's really seems to be very good at this, and it started to change the mother's mindset towards the raising of her daughter. Focus on what she does well, the counselor said. Build on that. Figure out what she loves and feels really good at. Discover the joys and the feelings of effectiveness that motivate her to go even further, and see if you can enlist those strengths in other contexts. So it's easy to find faults, to see where the walls are breaking down, where things are disastrous. It takes a special kind of character to discern decency, celebrate strengths, draw out distinctives. And I know that I found this in counseling individuals and couples over the years. If you can build their confidence in areas where they're already fairly strong, they're a lot more likely to engage the areas where they're weaker. So maybe there's a person you can think of right now, or a situation in your life where that perspective could be helpful. So this appears to be Nehemiah's first instinct. Let's go to the place where the walls are better. The hard truth is that there was not a lot to build on in Jerusalem. Verse 13 suggests that even the southernmost walls were broken down and the gates had been destroyed by fire. And having scouted that southernmost perimeter of the city, Nehemiah now moves around to the eastern slope of Jerusalem. And he says, verse 14, then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool. Now behind the wall, in the area that Nehemiah is describing, was the king's pool. It was a bathing area that was watered by a spring that had been dug by old King Hezekiah and that had given the fountain gate its name. In New Testament times, this particular fountain and pool were known as the Pool of Siloam. Any of you heard of that term before? It's the place that Jesus instructed a blind man to go and wash himself after restoring his sight. We read that in John chapter 9. The wall of the city at this particular point had been supported since King David's time by a whole series of earth and stone terraces that kind of pushed up and held up the wall. But archaeologists who were digging in this particular area way back in the 1960s found that the terraces had completely collapsed, and they dated the ruins of the supporting terraces back to the time prior to Nehemiah. So what had happened? The terraces, the supporting structure, had fallen away, and the walls now had folded in on themselves. And the cascading jumble of stones that they found there, that archaeologists found, could account for something of Nehemiah's statement at the end of verse 14, where he says, there was not enough room for my mount to get through. Think of this jumble of stones, and he's struggling to get his horse through the place. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. Okay. It's been a long night already, okay? He's made a lot of progress in assessing conditions. and he's got a fairly good sense of some of the challenges that he faces. It has been 130 years since Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had sieged, sacked, and shattered the city. And Nehemiah, like many other Jews, had dared to think that the returning exiles, led by Ezra, had made some considerable progress in rebuilding the place. He had hoped that the report of Hanani, his cousin, and the others that had visited him up in Susa, that their report on Jerusalem, he had hoped that they were exaggerating. That maybe they didn't have a good engineering eye and didn't appreciate the actual conditions. And what Nehemiah actually found was they had way understated the devastation. It was a lot worse. and the walls and the gates, looked like one of those, I don't know if you remember, well, certainly after 9/11, you remember the rubble, right? Or after the bombing of the building, the federal building in Oklahoma City, just the devastation. And so Nehemiah has checked out the walls and the gates most likely to be in the best condition, and he finds they're even destroyed beyond recognition. And he thinks to himself, this is conjecture, he must be thinking to himself, if it looks like this here in the south, how much worse is it everywhere else? And you can just imagine them walking through the in the shadows. Maybe the sun is starting to come up, and they're just crestfallen as they see the devastation. It's like one of those scenes out of The Walking Dead or Planet of the Apes or any post-apocalyptic movie you've ever seen, where the survivors are moving through and just seeing how things are just so broken down. And imagine it's dawn now, and there's these ragamuffin children running around with torn clothes and smudged faces, and they're scavenging rubbish heaps for food. And maybe they pass by a gaggle of old women who are staring at him from these hollow-eyed sockets. And their hopes and the health have grown so haggard with the march of days that just don't ever get any better. And as daylight turns the sky to a stale yellow, Nehemiah enters some assembly hall that's roughly still there to meet a gathering of bureaucrats and merchants and clergymen who had been rounded up to meet the dignitary from Susa. And Nehemiah writes, verse 16, "The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others." And then he adds a phrase that seems either comic or clueless. He refers to them as the officials or any others who would be doing the work. And he looks at these discouraged, apathetic people, this ragtag band of beleaguered citizens, this circle of wan survivors whose efforts and those of 3 generations of their predecessors had hardly managed to set one stone upon a stone. And Nehemiah looks at them, and instead of just saying, "What the heck have you guys been doing?" he ennobles them by speaking of them as the ones who at long last would be doing the work that had gone wanting for more than a century. "Then I said to them," verse 17, "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." And I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. And I think that there's this wonderful leadership lesson here. If ever there was a lesson, it's this. No matter how difficult the problems are, a leader pictures the possible. Because with God on your side, anything is possible. Anything is possible. I think, was it Richard Blackaby we had this past year? Or is he coming? Was he just here? Does that ring a bell for any of you? I can't remember whether he's coming up or whether he was past. But his father, Henry, the author of the ground-shaking book, Experiencing God, once said that the chief problem confronting humanity today is the lack of a God-sized vision. And I want to quote him. Our nation does not rise. I think it's him. This might be me. I'll credit him. Our nation does not rise above selfishness, apathy, and fear because its politicians have not successfully pictured forward a dream large enough to stir the faintly glowing embers of the American spirit. Our children do not rise above their preoccupation with the latest techno toys and test score. That's probably me. That's a phrase I use a lot. Because their parents and grandparents have not successfully pictured for them a sacred destiny and a spiritual discipline that moves them beyond merely making a living to making a life. Our businesses do not rise above their focus on the bottom line because their executives do not picture for their employees and shareholders a large enough vision for contributing to the commonwealth, to the common good. Our churches do not rise above their sleepy sanctuaries because their pastors have not successfully pictured for them the king and a kingdom that calls us beyond our comfortable rituals and our superficial relationships and our institutional survival and compels us to be Christ to the world, to be salt and light as we were called to be. And the writer of Proverbs sums it up well when he says in Proverbs 29, where there is no vision, what happens? The people perish. How important it is to have a vision. And note how Nehemiah spells it out. He doesn't appeal to external interests like security, but to internal interests first. Let's dispel the disgrace. Let's no longer be in disgrace. He inspires them not by calling them to the good life, but to a life that is good. He emphasizes the blessing of God on the project. He makes it clear that God was with him in the effort, that they would not have to do this alone. And I'm convinced that our families and our business places and our social circles, churches, etc., still need visionary leaders. And it's not just that role of vision casting is not confined to people that have microphones on their heads or stand up on a platform. There's a vision casting role for every single one of us in this world. We need people who perseveringly call themselves and other people to a vision of being genuinely good on the inside and not just looking good on the outside. We need people who repeatedly articulate confidence that those who pursue Christ-like character and godly purposes can be assured of receiving riches that will absolutely embarrass this world's concept of wealth. And we need people who faithfully demonstrate that where any child or grandchild or friend or brother or sister or any workplace colleague is truly pursuing the purposes of God, he or she can count on us standing by them, even when that pursuit costs them deeply in the world's currency. Arnold Toynbee was a great English historian, and he once observed this. Apathy can only be overcome by enthusiasm. And enthusiasm can only be aroused by two things. First, an ideal which takes the imagination by storm. And second, a definite, intelligible plan for carrying that ideal into practice. Nehemiah clearly excites this kind of enthusiasm, which, by the way, you know what the root word of enthusiasm is? Dan, what is it? Entheos. Entheos. It's being filled by God is the idea of enthusiasm, to be entheos. Dan was the chairman of the music department at Yale University, and he and his wife, Ann, my childhood friends. And they're here visiting from the great state of Vermont today. So happy to have them with us here. And so Nehemiah has this enthusiasm. He pictures the possible for the demoralized people of Jerusalem, and he has a specific plan for the construction project. And as a result, the next words, they replied, "Let us start rebuilding." We're in. Let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Every time there's good work going on, there's going to be opposition. I've never been part of a project, no matter how good it was, that didn't have naysayers. Does that ring true for you, your experience? It's always people say, this is why we can't do it, shouldn't do it, won't do it. And so we're told in verse 19, but when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I don't know if you've ever encountered an opponent in some debate or venture that you were engaged in who says all of the politically correct things, whose arguments actually seem somewhat reasonable on the surface of things, but you're still left with this nagging intuition that what is motivating their opposition has really very little to do with the principles or the issues being discussed. Something in their past was being hooked. Some disgruntlement. Maybe they were making a play for power, not so much as a play for principle. Maybe they just didn't like you. Maybe they just didn't like you very much. And in any case, as we're going to see when we get on to chapter 4 in 2027, the three people mentioned here, I'm kidding you, as opponents of Nehemiah's plan are not really the champions of Jerusalem's welfare. They are not really loyal to the king of Persia, but they're pretending to be at this moment. Each of them actually has a very selfish interest in keeping the walls of Jerusalem broken down and the city impoverished and defenseless. And suffice it to say here that Nehemiah isn't cowed, isn't fooled by them in the slightest. Nehemiah has been around the block as a leader. That's why he was cupbearer of the king. He has lots of experience with oppositions. Verse 20 says, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Nehemiah emphasizes here that those who oppose the rebuilding are doing so only because they have no actual historic or spiritual link to the deep significance of the city and of the true spirituality of God's people. And Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem are like the Pharisees who consistently opposed and tested Jesus along the way. They were always claiming great concern, these Pharisees. They always great concern for the holiness of Israel, for the well-being of Israel. They wanted righteousness and the law. That's what they were out to protect. But Jesus saw what was going on. He knew that in reality, their lives, their inner lives were rotting. He says, you're like whited sepulchres, he said to the Pharisees. Their inner life had rotted. And they were enforcing the rules only to keep the focus on other people's failings and to keep them from having to really look deeply inside. Nehemiah was no more swayed in his purposes by these people, these sorts of people, than Nehemiah was, or Nehemiah and Jesus were similar in this respect. And Nehemiah knows that God has given him a great job to do. He has been sent to rebuild the city, and the next chapter of the book, and I'm grateful to say we're getting on to the third chapter next week. The next chapter tells us how Nehemiah went about the business of doing that. I love all of you. Thank you for the privilege of studying this together. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you very soon again.
That's a wrap for today. Just want to say thank you for joining us for this study. If you know of others who might appreciate the chance to listen into this sort of content, please encourage them to go to YouTube or Apple Podcasts and search for the Ocean Reef Chapel channel. Once again, I'm Dan Meyer, and I hope you'll come back soon to enjoy more of the light from Ocean Reef.